A father and his son were in a car accident. The father dies at the scene. The boy, badly injured, is rushed to the local hospital. At the hospital, the operating surgeon looks at the boy and says, "I can't operate on this boy, he's my son." This riddle is designed to test our implicit biases. To me, implicit bias is the unconscious social assumptions we develop due to our social environments, upbringing, and conditioning. It is how sexism, homophobia, racism, ageism, classism, discrimination manifests in some of the kindest and educated of people. Nurses, doctors, teachers, social workers, paramedics, police officers, lawyers, judges, preachers, politicians, myself, my friends, my family. None of us are to blame, and yet none of us are exempt. A father and his son were in a car accident. The father dies at the scene. The boy, badly injured, is rushed to the local hospital. At the hospital, the operating surgeon looks at the boy and says, "I can't operate on this boy, he's my son." When I was first presented with this riddle, the leader of the workshop presented that two very possible possibilities are: one, the boy has two fathers, the surgeon is a queer man, and two, the surgeon is a woman. Despite identifying as a queer feminist, neither of these answers crossed my mind. And in the revelation of the overseen possibilities, my body increased in heat, my gaze turned downward. How could I have been so stupid? So ignorant, a sexist, a homophobe, identities I didn't want to identify with, identities that conflict with values I actively strive for: diversity, equity, inclusion. This wasn't who I was, or rather, this wasn't who I wanted to be. But for like many people, closing that gap is a challenge fundamental in constructing the human identity. We are products of our environments to some degree, perhaps a degree we can be slow to acknowledge and accept. I was born and raised a Catholic girl, baptized at 4 months and confirmed at age 11. And while no longer currently identifying, the hours I spent in Mass every Sunday and in catechism after school every Tuesday, in addition to my mother's mothers and father's fathers' heritages rooted in Catholicism, have undeniably shaped me, molding my implicit biases, my unconscious beliefs. I believe this plays a considerable piece of how I came to the conclusion that the father who died in the car with his son was actually a Catholic priest. And while perhaps an option worth considering, I think coming to the conclusions that one, the boy has two fathers, the surgeon is a queer man, and two, the surgeon is a woman, are possibilities a lot more pragmatic for the 21st century. I believe this can be a testimony that those who are convicted of sexism, homophobia, racism, ageism, classism, discrimination, more often than not, or at least I dare to believe, do not mean to be sexist, homophobes, racists, people who carry out discrimination, but rather due to our social environments, upbringing, and conditioning, have rooted social assumptions and behaviors so deeply ingrained into our psyches and systems, we can be unaware when we are carrying out inequity despite valuing equity. In 2008, there was a man by the name of Brian Sinclair. Brian was a 45-year-old Indigenous male. He presented to an ER in Winnipeg with an infection, and in waiting over 34 hours for healthcare, the infection escalated into sepsis, and Brian died before being seen. In the investigation of his death, there were claims that Brian was not attended to because healthcare staff perceived Brian to be a drunk Indigenous man who simply needed to sleep off the alcohol and therefore not in need of medical attention. Ignored to death. In 2017, John Rivers, a 23-year-old Black male, presented to a hospital located in the Greater Toronto area. Body battered with headaches and shortness of breath, instead of being met with empathy and compassion as our healthcare system recommends, John was accused by the triaging nurse of faking his pain to obtain pharmaceutical drugs. This was only a stepping stone to the repeated oppression and discrimination John would face as he persevered to get the healthcare he needed over the following months, falling through the cracks. In 2020, Joyce Etchewan, a 37-year-old Indigenous mom, sought treatment for stomach pains at a hospital in Quebec. Joyce recorded her last moments on Facebook Live, and as she cried out in pain, comments like, "You're stupid as hell. What are your children gonna think seeing you like this? She's good for having sex more than anything else," were made by the attending nurses. Joyce's friend questions in retrospect, what if she didn't record this? What would they have said? That she just died, killed by racism. It's stories like these that make my stomach churn, chest clench, and head cloud. How could people who have dedicated their careers to caring and compassion be so cruel and callous? And who else has faced discrimination at their hands, but instead their stories have been swept under the rug instead of being brought to our attention for restitution? but doing my best to remember that implicit bias is the unconscious social assumptions we develop to our social environments, upbringing, and conditioning. It is how sexism, homophobia, racism, ageism, classism, discrimination manifests in some of the kindest and educated of people. None of us are to blame, and yet none of us are exempt. And who do we hold accountable for that? In an effort to be accountable for my implicit biases, the ones I did not choose, but the ones I am not exempt from, who has been hurt by my words, or at my hands, or my inaction, silence, and denial? Brian, John, and Joyce's stories are some of the worst possible outcomes of healthcare providers and their unchallenged implicit biases. But there have been times where I have stood in hospital as a nursing student and wondered, is this discrimination in action? A Black man labeled as drug-seeking and past nursing documentation. An Indigenous woman called a bad egg at the nursing station. A Black woman described as demanding and entitled by numerous nurses. When all I saw was someone who needed pain medication for a severely excruciating medical diagnosis. Someone who carried the weight of generations of cultural genocide and exploitation. Someone who justifyingly felt threatened and defensive in the care of a white healthcare system. Discrimination isn't black or white, all or nothing, this or that. It's usually those incredibly gray circumstances, the subtle moments, the microaggressions that leave us feeling off, as if something unjust just occurred and yet no one said anything. The road to unraveling our implicit biases is long, hard, uncomfortable, and at times even alienating. But if we continue down the path of blissful ignorance, we continue to run the risk of creating more stories like Brian, John, and Joyce's. The tools are here: books, YouTube videos, podcasts, Instagram pages, conferences, clubs, committees. There's something for each and every one of us wherever we're at in our journeys. Those journeys have to start by accepting implicit biases live and breathe in us, and that is to no fault of our own making. Making compassion and accountability to ourselves and others as key ingredients we need to be the change we want to see. Applying compassion seems simple enough, but hearing we are not the equity defenders we envisioned ourselves to be can integrate feelings of guilt, shame, and blame, emotions powerful enough to shut down those with even the brightest of intentions from understanding and exploring how we can become better versions of ourselves to contribute to better versions of our ever-evolving histories. To me, implicit bias is the unconscious social assumptions we develop due to our social environments, upbringing, and conditioning. It is how sexism, homophobia, racism, ageism, classism, discrimination manifests in some of the kindest and educated of people. Nurses, doctors, teachers, social workers, paramedics, police officers, lawyers, judges, preachers, politicians, myself, my friends, my family, and you. None of us are to blame, and yet none of us are exempt. Compassion and accountability to and for ourselves and others are the key ingredients we need to be the change we want to see to contribute to better versions of our ever-evolving histories. Thank you.